Maybe someone should remind the old man this is America. The sentence did not come loudly. It did not need to. It slid across the private dining room like a silver knife across porcelain, quiet enough for the cruel to pretend it was harmless, sharp enough for every decent person to feel the cut. At Bellafure, 30 floors above Midtown Manhattan, the chandeliers glowed like frozen rain, the white tablecloths fell in perfect lines, and every wine glass held a reflection of someone powerful trying to look even more powerful. This was not just dinner. This was theater with a $200 million donation pledge hiding beneath the candlelight. At the center of the long mahogany table sat Julian Romano, billionaire CEO of Romano Global Holdings, a man whose name could move markets before breakfast and silence boardrooms before lunch. His suit was dark navy, tailored within an inch of perfection. His cufflinks were old gold. His smile was polished, practiced, and already tired. Beside him sat his father, Salvatore Romano, 82 years old, thin as a winter branch, dressed in a brown jacket that looked expensive but somehow still carried the humility of a man who had spent half his life working with his hands. Salvatore had been born in a small Sicilian village before coming to New York with one suitcase, one photograph of his mother, and a belief that America rewarded people who refused to quit. Tonight, surrounded by donors, investors, museum trustees, and men who measured kindness only after tax deductions, the old man had tried to tell a story. Not a business story, not a polished one, a memory. Something about his mother singing near an open window, about lemon trees, about bread cooling on a stone counter, about a word no one at the table understood because it was not Italian from a textbook. It was Sicilian, old Sicilian, the kind that lived in kitchens, not conference rooms. At first, a few guests smiled politely. Then the smiles tightened. Someone cleared his throat. Someone else looked down at his phone. Julian's jaw flexed once, the only crack in his perfect face. "Dad," he said softly, but the softness had edges. "Not tonight." Salvatore stopped speaking. His hand, spotted with age, settled on the folded napkin beside his plate. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was expensive. It had marble under it. It had judgment in it. Standing near the service station with a crystal pitcher of still water in both hands, Maya Brooks heard everything. She was 26, shy by habit and invisible by training, a black waitress in a room where people looked at name tags only when they wanted to complain. Her uniform was pressed. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her shoes had already carried her through 9 hours of standing, walking, smiling, disappearing. All night, she had been called sweetheart twice, miss once, and girl by a man who never looked up from his steak. She had said nothing. Maya was good at saying nothing. Silence had helped her survive rooms that were not built with her comfort in mind. But when Salvatore's face lowered, when the light in his eyes folded in on itself, something inside her shifted. Because she knew that look. She had seen it on old faces in Queens, in laundromats, in church basements, in corner grocery stores where people carried entire countries in their accents and were made to feel small for it. The donor who made the comment lifted his wine again, pleased with himself. Julian heard it. Everyone knew Julian heard it. But the billionaire CEO did not defend his father. He only stared at the table, trapped between blood and image, between the man who raised him and the room he wanted to own. Maya stepped forward to refill Salvatore's glass. Her hands were steady, but her heart beat hard enough to count. She could have walked away. That would have been safe. That would have been smart. That would have been what the room expected from her. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the old man and spoke in a voice so gentle it almost disappeared into the candlelight. Not in English, not in polished Italian. In the same Sicilian dialect Salvatore had just been shamed for using. "Your mother must have sung that song to you." The room froze. For one long second, nobody moved. Not the investors with their polished watches, not the museum trustees with their careful smiles, not Julian Romano with his hand still resting beside a glass of untouched Cabernet. Even the soft piano near the bar seemed to lose its courage. Salvatore looked up slowly, as if the voice had not come from the young waitress beside him, but from a doorway in time that had opened somewhere behind the candlelight. His lips parted. His eyes searched Maya's face, not with confusion, but with recognition of something he had believed was gone from rooms like this. "You know those words?" he asked, his voice trembling at the edges. Maya lowered the pitcher gently to the table, careful not to make the crystal touch too loudly. A little, she answered in the same old dialect. Humble, almost apologetic. But it was not a little. Everyone could hear that much, even if they could not understand the words. It had rhythm. It had warmth. It had the soft, weathered music of kitchens, church steps, open windows, and women who measured love in bread and patience. Salvatore stared at her as if she had just handed him a photograph he had lost 70 years ago. Julian's face changed first in the eyes. The confidence did not vanish all at once. Men like Julian did not lose control that quickly. It cracked quietly, like ice beneath a footstep. He looked from Maya to his father, then back to Maya again, trying to understand how someone he had barely noticed all night had stepped into the most private part of his family history without asking permission. Around the table, the guests shifted in their seats. The donor who had made the cruel remark lowered his wineglass, but did not drink. His smile had disappeared. Nobody was laughing now, not because they suddenly understood Sicily or age or loneliness, but because they understood power when they saw it change hands. Maya had not raised her voice. She had not embarrassed anyone on purpose. She had simply answered an old man in the language the room had tried to bury. That made it worse for them. Kindness, when it arrives quietly, leaves no place for arrogance to hide. Julian cleared his throat. Maya, is it? He said, reading her name tag as if discovering she had a name for the first time. Maya turned toward him, respectful but not small. Yes, sir. There it was, the old script trying to return. Sir. Waitress. CEO. Table. Service. But the room could feel it no longer fit as neatly as it had 5 minutes earlier. Salvatore reached for Maya's hand with a gentleness that asked before it touched, and she allowed him to hold her fingers between both of his. His hands were cool, fragile, and covered in the map of a life that had built something before his son ever knew what an empire was. My mother used to sing that when the rain came, he said, switching into English now, as though he wanted the whole table to hear. I have not heard anyone say it correctly since my sister passed. His voice thinned on the last word. Julian looked down. For years, he had told himself his father's old stories were harmless but inconvenient, sweet but poorly timed, part of a past that did not belong under chandeliers or near billion-dollar conversations. He had built Romano Global Holdings into a monument of American success, glass towers, clean branding, perfect interviews, charity galas that photographed well from every angle. He told reporters his family came from nothing, but he preferred that nothing to remain vague, inspirational, and safely edited. Salvatore was not edited. Salvatore remembered the basement apartment in Bensonhurst, the winter coats bought secondhand, the 12-hour shifts in a bakery where flour stayed under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubbed. He remembered being mocked for his accent, then praised decades later for raising a son who sounded nothing like him. And tonight, Julian had almost let the room teach his father the same old shame all over again. Maya saw it settle over him. Not guilt yet. Not fully. But the first weight of understanding. The kind that does not shout. The kind that sits down beside a man and refuses to leave. Before anyone at the table could decide what to do with the silence, Maya stepped back half an inch, the way servers learn to do when they accidentally become too visible. She reached for the water pitcher again. Not because anyone needed water, but because her hands needed a job and the room needed a reason to breathe. That was how Maya Brooks had survived most of her life, by becoming useful before becoming noticed. Useful girls were forgiven for standing in expensive rooms. Useful girls could pass through judgment without leaving fingerprints. She had learned that early in Queens, in a fourth-floor apartment where the radiator clanged through winter nights and the hallway smelled like detergent, garlic, and old rain. Her mother, Denise Brooks, worked double shifts at a rehabilitation center near Jamaica Avenue, leaving before sunrise with coffee in a travel mug and coming home with her feet swollen inside white nursing shoes. Maya was 8 years old when Mrs. Lucia Belanca moved into apartment 4B, a widow from Sicily with silver hair, black dresses, and grocery bags full of tomatoes, basil, and stories. At first, Maya only carried her bags upstairs. Then she stayed for soup. Then for homework, then for whole afternoons while her mother worked overtime. Lucia did not speak like the teachers at school. Her English bent around old sounds. Her Italian was different from the Italian on television. And her Sicilian was something else entirely, rough and sweet at once, like stones warmed by sun. She called Maya Pixarita, little girl, and taught her words while stirring sauce in a pot big enough to feed grief itself. Maya learned without meaning to learn. She learned the names of herbs, prayers whispered over bread, lullabies that sounded happy until you heard the ache underneath them. Lucia would point to the window when rain streaked the glass and say the same phrase Salvatore had used tonight, the one about mothers singing storms into mercy. Maya never forgot it, because children remember the language of people who make them feel safe. Years later, when Lucia grew frail and her sons visited less often, Maya was the one who sat beside her, reading mail, calling doctors, warming soup, listening to stories about a village near the sea where lemons grew brighter than streetlights in New York. Maya was not fluent because she wanted applause. She was fluent because love repeats itself until it becomes memory. But nobody at Bellafure knew that. They saw a black waitress with quiet eyes and sensible shoes. They saw service. They saw background. They did not see the girl who had translated hospital forms for an old woman who was scared of being misunderstood. They did not see the teenager who had skipped school dances to sit beside Lucia during storms. They did not see the young woman who still kept Lucia's rosary in a small blue box at the back of her dresser, not because she was Catholic, but because grief sometimes needs an object to hold. Julian Romano certainly had not seen any of that when he walked in that night. To him, the evening had been a calculation. Donors on the left, board members on the right. His father positioned close enough to look sentimental, far enough not to interrupt. That was the plan. A clean story. A controlled legacy. A son honoring his immigrant father without letting that father speak too much. But Maya had broken the frame with one sentence, and now the old man was alive in a way no press release could manufacture. Salvatore leaned toward her, his eyes shining, and asked softly in Sicilian if she knew the second verse. Maya hesitated, not because she did not know it, but because she understood what would happen if she sang. The room would no longer be able to pretend this was a party. It would have to become human. Julian looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time all night, the most powerful man in the room seemed to be waiting for permission from the woman holding the water pitcher. Maya did not sing loudly. She did not perform. She did not turn toward the room or lift her chin like someone trying to impress the people who had ignored her. She simply bent a little closer to Salvatore, lowered her voice into the warm space between them, and gave the old song back to the person who had carried it alone for too long. The words moved softly from her mouth, old Sicilian syllables shaped by memory rather than ambition. They were not perfect in the way a professor would measure perfection. They were better than that. They were lived in. They had steam from Lucia Belanca's kitchen inside them. They had Queen's rain against a window. They had a little black girl sitting at a small table, repeating sounds until an old widow smiled through loneliness. Salvatore closed his eyes before the second line ended. His shoulders, which had been stiff all evening beneath that brown jacket, began to loosen. He did not look like the father of a billionaire then. He looked like a boy hearing his mother call him in from the street. That was what stopped the room. Not the language. Not the surprise. The tenderness. The unbearable tenderness of seeing a man return to himself in front of people who had been too busy admiring money to notice a soul. Julian stood halfway from his chair without meaning to. The movement made the table shift, and a spoon touched porcelain with a tiny sound that seemed too loud for the moment. He froze there, one hand on the edge of the table, his polished confidence suddenly useless. He had prepared for speeches, pledges, negotiations, photographs, and applause. He had not prepared for his father to cry quietly because a waitress remembered a song that his own son had stopped hearing years ago. Across the table, the donor who had made the comment stared down at his folded menu as if the gold lettering had become fascinating. 2 seats away, a woman from the museum board pressed her lips together, her eyes wet but guarded, the way people cry when they are not sure they have earned the right. The servers near the wall stood completely still. Even Bellafiore's manager, who normally measured every second of a VIP dinner like a banker counting cash, did not interrupt. For once, service stopped serving power and began witnessing grace. When Maya finished, she straightened slowly and looked at Salvatore, not Julian, not the donors, not the room. Mrs. Lucia used to say that song was for storms, she said gently in English. She said mothers sang it so children would not be afraid of thunder. Salvatore opened his eyes. Lucia, he repeated, the name catching on something deep inside him. Maya nodded. Lucia Belanca. She lived in my building in Queens. Apartment 4B. She was from Sicily. Salvatore stared at her. The color drained from Julian's face, not from fear, but from the sudden arrival of a connection too strange to dismiss. Salvatore's fingers tightened around his napkin. Belanca, he whispered. From Caltabellata? Maya blinked. Yes. The room shifted again, but this time the silence had a pulse. Salvatore brought one hand to his mouth, overcome by the shape of a memory that had just stepped into the present wearing a waitress uniform. Lucia was my cousin, he said. We lost touch after she moved to Queens. I thought she had no one here. Maya's breath caught. For years, she had believed Lucia's stories belonged to another world, one that had ended in a small apartment full of basil, prayer cards, and old photographs. But now that world was sitting at this table, trembling under chandelier light. Julian looked at Maya as if the floor beneath him had changed. All evening, he had treated his father's past like a detail to manage. Maya had treated it like a treasure to protect. And in that difference, the whole room saw the truth. The shy waitress had not entered their world. She had revealed how small their world had been. For a moment, Maya forgot the room was full of billionaires. She forgot the chandelier, the donors, the cameras, the crisp uniforms, the polished silver, the impossible price of every bottle breathing on the sideboard. She only saw Salvatore Romano staring at her with the stunned tenderness of a man who had just found a living thread tied to someone he thought time had taken forever. She talked about you, Maya said softly. Not by your last name at first. She called you Little Toto. She said you used to steal figs and blame the goats. Salvatore let out a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, and somehow more honest than either. A few guests looked away because sincerity can embarrass people who have spent too long worshipping appearances. Julian did not look away. He could not. He was watching his father become young and old at the same time. He was watching a waitress do with one memory what he had failed to do with penthouses, doctors, private drivers, and carefully scheduled Sunday lunches. She had reached him. Not the public version of him. Not the immigrant success story printed in gala programs. Him. Salvatore Romano from a narrow stone street in Sicily. Salvatore who missed his mother. Salvatore who had a cousin named Lucia and a song for thunderstorms. She kept a photograph, Maya continued. A group of children near a church wall. She said one boy had ears too big for his head and a smile that got him into trouble. Salvatore pointed to himself with a trembling smile. That was me. This time, the laugh that moved through the room was gentle, not cruel. It rose carefully, as if everyone understood laughter had to ask permission now. Maya smiled back, but her eyes lowered quickly. She was still not used to taking up space. The manager stepped closer, nervous, whispering her name as a warning. It was small, barely audible, but Julian heard it. He turned sharply, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet authority that made the manager stop in place. Let her speak, Julian said. 3 simple words. Yet for Maya, they landed strangely. She had spent years being told to speak less, move faster, smile more, stay pleasant, stay safe. Now the man who owned the room was asking the room to listen. But listening was not a gift from him. It was overdue. Salvatore reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded cream-colored envelope, worn soft at the edges. I brought this tonight, he said, looking at Julian now. I wanted to show you after dessert. Julian frowned slightly. What is it? Salvatore opened the envelope with careful fingers and removed a small black and white photograph. He placed it on the table between the wine glasses. The room leaned toward it without meaning to. It showed a younger Salvatore outside a bakery in Brooklyn, flower on his shirt, one arm around a woman with bright eyes and silver-pinned hair. On the back, written in old blue ink, was a name. Lucia Belanca. Maya brought one hand to her chest. The air left her gently. That is her, she whispered. Salvatore nodded. She helped me when I first came to America. Before I had money. Before I had English. Before anyone called me sir. Julian stared at the photograph as if it accused him without speaking. His whole empire had been built on origin stories, but the real origin was smaller, humbler, and sitting under his hand. A bakery, a cousin, a borrowed room in Queens. A woman who had later become family to a black girl his world would have overlooked. The donor who had mocked Salvatore shifted in his chair. "Well," he said, forcing a brittle smile, "that is quite a coincidence." Maya looked at him then. Not harshly, not dramatically, just directly. Some things are only coincidences when you do not know who has been carrying the story. The smile died on his face. No one rescued him from the silence. Not this time. Julian Romano felt the silence move toward him like a tide he could no longer command. All his life, rooms had adjusted around him. Assistants lowered their voices when he entered. Lawyers rearranged language until risk sounded like opportunity. Reporters laughed at jokes that were not funny because his name looked good in a headline. But this silence did not work for him. It worked on him. It pressed against the polished version of his life and found the places where the shine had been hiding shame. He looked at the photograph again, at Lucia Belanca standing beside his father outside that bakery in Brooklyn, and something in him began to loosen painfully. He remembered that bakery, though he had spent years pretending he did not. He remembered being 6 years old, sitting on sacks of flour while his father cleaned ovens before sunrise. He remembered the smell of yeast in his coat when he went to school, and how he once begged Salvatore not to speak Sicilian in front of his classmates because a boy had laughed at the way the word sounded. His father had gone quiet after that. Not angry, not wounded in a way a child could recognize. Just quiet. Julian had mistaken that quiet for agreement. Now, 34 years later, under a chandelier worth more than the bakery had made in a month, he finally understood that his father had not stopped speaking because the language was small. He had stopped because his son had asked him to make himself smaller. Salvatore watched Julian with tired patience, the kind only parents seem able to hold. Maya saw it too, and she wished she could disappear again, because some truths are private even when they arrive in public. But the room had already become a mirror, and every person at that table was trapped inside what it reflected. The donor cleared his throat as if preparing to rescue the evening with charm. "Julian, perhaps we should continue the program. The pledge announcement is scheduled for 9 o'clock. It was a reasonable sentence. Polite, practical, empty. Julian looked at him slowly. "No," he said. One word, soft enough to be civilized, firm enough to close a door. The donor blinked. The museum chairwoman shifted in her seat. The manager near the wall stopped breathing for half a second. Julian pushed his chair back and stood fully now. He did not stand like a man about to dominate. He stood like a man trying not to fall apart in public. "Before anything else continues," he said, his voice low, "I owe my father an apology." Salvatore's eyes widened. Maya lowered her gaze, not out of fear, but respect. Julian turned toward his father. The speeches he had rehearsed for the evening vanished. The perfect words left him. What remained was rougher, slower, and more honest than anything his public relations team would have approved. "Dad, I have spent years telling people I came from humble beginnings, but I cleaned the humility out of the story until it sounded expensive. I let them admire your sacrifice without hearing your voice. And tonight, when someone made you feel like your own memories did not belong here, I said nothing." His throat tightened, but he continued, "I am sorry." No one applauded. Applause would have ruined it. Salvatore stared at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Maya and said something in Sicilian, too soft for most of the table to catch. Maya's eyes filled, but she nodded. Julian turned to her. "What did he say?" Maya took a breath. "He said, I was never ashamed of where we came from. I was only afraid you were." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Julian closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the billionaire was still there, but the armor was not. He walked around the table, knelt beside his father's chair just enough to meet him eye to eye, and placed one hand over Salvatore's. "I was," he admitted, "and I should have been ashamed of that instead." Salvatore's face trembled, then softened. He touched Julian's cheek the way a father touches a son who is still, somewhere beneath the suit and the empire, a boy covered in bakery flour. Across the room, Maya stood quietly with the water pitcher at her side, no longer invisible, no longer merely useful, but still humble enough not to claim the moment as her own. Yet everyone knew the truth. She had not interrupted the dinner. She had restored it. The apology did not make the evening smaller. It made every expensive thing in the room seem less important. For the first time since the guests had arrived, No one was performing wealth. The candles still burned, the skyline still glittered beyond the tall windows, and the plates still carried food arranged with the precision of artwork, but the center of the night had moved. It was no longer the pledge. It was no longer the cameras. It was no longer Julian Romano proving that success could polish a family name until no rough edges remained. It was Salvatore holding his son's hand, and Maya Brooks standing close enough to witness the kind of repair money could not buy. Then the donor who had made the first remark pushed back his chair. His name was Preston Vale, a real estate magnate with a smile that usually arrived before sincerity did. He adjusted his dinner jacket, looked around the table, and tried to recover the room the way men like him always did, with charm wrapped around damage. "Mr. Romano," he said, "I truly meant no disrespect. It was only a harmless comment." Maya looked down at the word harmless as if it had fallen on the carpet between them. Harmless. People used that word when they wanted pain to disappear without accountability. Salvatore did not answer. Julian did. "It was not harmless," he said. His voice was controlled, but the old smoothness was gone. It was familiar. That sentence traveled farther than anger would have. A few guests shifted because they understood exactly what he meant. Familiar was the joke at the office about someone's accent. Familiar was the smile after a woman's name was mispronounced for the third time. Familiar was the way people praised immigrant sacrifice while mocking immigrant sound. Familiar was the way Maya had been called girl by a man whose own daughter was probably her age. Preston's face tightened. He was not used to being corrected in public, especially not by a man whose foundation he had planned to impress. "I apologize," he said, this time less polished. Julian looked at Maya. "Not to me." The room turned with him. Maya felt every gaze land on her shoulders. She wanted to step backward. Her body remembered every rule of service. Do not embarrass guests. Do not challenge donors. Do not become the problem. But Lucia's voice seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside her memory. "A child who listens with love will never be poor." Maya placed the water pitcher on the side table and folded her hands in front of her. Preston looked uncomfortable now, almost offended by the humility being required of him. "Miss Brooks," he said, forcing the words into shape, "I apologize for what I said, and for what it suggested." Maya studied him for a second. She did not smile to make him feel better. She did not punish him either. "Thank you," she said. "But you did not only insult Mr. Romano. You insulted every person who has ever had to translate themselves to be treated with respect." The sentence was quiet. It was also final. Somewhere near the wall, one of the younger servers blinked fast and looked away. Julian saw that too. He saw the staff lined against the edges of the room like furniture with heartbeats. He saw the people who had carried the evening while being excluded from its meaning. And once you see that, really see it, you cannot return to blindness without choosing it. Salvatore lifted the old photograph and held it toward Maya. "Lucia had family," he said. "You." Maya's breath caught. She had not expected that. She had spent years believing she was only the neighbor girl who helped, only the child Lucia fed because kindness had overflowed her small kitchen. But Salvatore was looking at her as if lineage was not only blood, as if memory could adopt the faithful. Julian turned to the museum chairwoman and the gathered donors. "The pledge tonight will still happen," he said. "But the terms are changing." The room sharpened. Money had returned, but now it had to answer to meaning. "Romano Global will fund the language preservation wing," he continued, "but not under my name." He looked at Maya, then at his father. "It will be called Lucia House." Salvatore closed his eyes, and this time, when tears came, no one treated them like weakness. The name Lucia House changed the temperature of the room. It did not sound like a corporate wing. It did not sound like a donor plaque polished for photographs. It sounded like an apartment door in Queens, a pot of soup on a small stove, a widow teaching a child that language could be a shelter when the world felt cold. Maya stood still, almost unable to accept that a woman who had passed quietly, with no headlines and no marble statue, had just been lifted into the center of a billionaire dinner where she had never once been invited. Salvatore held the photograph against his chest. Julian watched him, and for the first time that night, he did not look like a man managing a legacy. He looked like a son trying to understand one. The museum chairwoman adjusted her glasses, her voice careful. "That is a generous change, Mr. Romano. We can prepare the announcement immediately." Julian shook his head. Not immediately. Not without Miss Brooks. Maya looked up. The room turned again, but this time the attention felt different. Still heavy, still uncomfortable, but less like judgment and more like responsibility. Me? She asked. Julian nodded. If Lucia House is going to carry her name, it should carry the truth of who she loved and who loved her back. Maya felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to refuse, to say she was only a waitress, to make herself smaller so powerful people could feel natural again. But Salvatore looked at her with such open trust that the lie would not leave her mouth. Then it cannot just be about Italian history, Maya said. Her voice was quiet, but the room had learned to lean in when she spoke. It should be for every family that came here with a language people told them to leave at the door. Sicilian, Spanish, Creole, Korean, Arabic, Gullah, whatever carries somebody's grandmother inside it. A younger server near the back lifted her eyes. A busser paused with a tray against his hip. Even Preston Vale seemed to understand that the conversation had moved beyond him. Julian listened without interrupting. That mattered. Not because listening erased what came before, but because it was the first honest thing he could offer. And it should not be built as charity, Maya continued. Charity can still look down at people. Build it as preservation. Build it as respect. Salvatore smiled faintly, pride moving across his face like sunrise over an old street. Julian nodded once. Then that is what we will do. The words were simple, but they did not feel simple. They felt like a door opening. Later, after the formal dinner dissolved into softer conversations and guests began speaking in lower voices, Julian found Maya near the service hallway, where the bright kitchen lights spilled across the carpet and the music from the dining room sounded far away. For once, he approached without an assistant, without a photographer, without the invisible machinery of importance around him. Miss Brooks, he said. Maya turned, still holding a folded linen cloth. Yes, Mr. Romano. He looked at the cloth, then at her tired shoes, then at her face. Not her name tag. Her face. I am sorry I did not see you before I needed you. Maya considered that. There were apologies people gave to clean their own conscience, and apologies that arrived carrying work. She was trying to decide which kind his was. Most people do not, she said. Julian accepted it. No defense. No speech. Just the truth standing between them. From the dining room, Salvatore called Maya's name gently, asking if she would sit with him for one more minute and tell him everything she remembered about Lucia. Maya looked toward the old man, then back at the billionaire. Julian stepped aside, not dramatically, not as a gesture for the room, just enough to clear the way. And in that small movement, Maya understood something had truly shifted. The man who had spent his life taking the center had finally learned how to make room. By the time midnight touched Manhattan, the dining room at Bellafere no longer looked like a place where powerful people had gathered to congratulate themselves. It looked softer now, almost humbled, as if the walls themselves had heard something true and could not go back to pretending. The skyline still burned beyond the glass, yellow windows stacked against the dark, taxis threading below like sparks through the avenues, but inside the private room, the evening had slowed to the pace of memory. Maya sat beside Salvatore for 10 minutes that became 30. She told him how Lucia used to keep basil in cracked clay pots on the fire escape, how she saved rubber bands in a coffee tin, how she scolded the television during weather reports, how she called every storm dramatic as if thunder were a neighbor making too much noise. Salvatore laughed until his eyes shined. Then he told Maya about Lucia as a girl, running through alleys with flour on her dress, hiding figs in her pockets, singing louder than the church bells because she believed heaven was hard of hearing. Between them, a woman who was gone became present again, not as a name on a document, not as a sentimental footnote, as a life. Julian stood nearby and listened, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood that some moments do not need his voice to become important. For years, he had believed success meant rising so high that no one could see the dirt on your shoes. He had changed his accent, his clothes, his neighborhood, his manners, even the way he told his father's story, until everything sounded clean enough for magazines and donors. But Maya had reminded him that dignity was never in the polish. It was in the hands that carried bread before they carried contracts. It was in the names people mispronounced and the songs they dismissed. It was in the quiet labor of women like Lucia and Denise Brooks and Maya herself. Women who kept people alive without ever being invited to the table. The next morning, a short video from the dinner appeared online. Someone had recorded the moment Maya spoke to Salvatore, the exact second the room froze, the old man's face lifting as if the past had reached across the table and touched him. The clip spread quickly, but what made people share it was not spectacle. It was recognition. Thousands of comments poured in from people who remembered grandmothers who spoke in old languages, fathers who hid their accents at work, mothers who translated entire lives after 12-hour shifts, children who learned early that being underestimated could become its own kind of education. Bellafiore received calls from reporters. Romano Global received requests for statements. Preston Vale released a careful apology that sounded less polished than his first attempt, which was probably why people believed it a little more. But Maya did not chase the attention. She finished her shifts. She called her mother. She visited Lucia's grave in Queens and placed fresh basil beside the stone because flowers felt too formal for a woman who had taught love through soup. A week later, Julian and Salvatore met Maya there. No cameras, no staff, no announcement. Just 3 people standing under a gray New York sky while traffic hummed beyond the cemetery fence. Julian placed the old photograph near the basil and whispered thank you, not only to Lucia, but to the past he had spent too long editing. Salvatore spoke a prayer in Sicilian. Maya understood every word. Months later, Lucia House opened in a restored brick building in Queens, not 30 floors above the city, but at street level, where people could walk in without feeling small. Its classrooms offered language preservation, translation support, oral history recording, and community dinners where every accent was treated like an inheritance. Maya became its first director, not because Julian rescued her, but because she had already been doing the work long before anyone with money learned its value. On opening night, Salvatore sat in the front row while children recited words from languages their families thought the world had forgotten. Julian stood at the back, quietly, hands folded, letting other people take the center. And when Maya looked across the room, she saw something more powerful than wealth. She saw people being heard. She saw memory becoming shelter. She saw a lesson no billionaire could buy his way into, and no cruel joke could erase. She had not shouted. She had not demanded worship. She had simply spoken with grace in a language love had taught her. And by doing so, she gave an old man back his childhood, gave a son back his father, and gave a room full of powerful people a truth they should have known all along. Power means nothing if it cannot make space for dignity.